share the message as well. Thanks. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our church this morning. As you can see, we're continuing on our series through the 10 Commandments called the 10 Words. And so if you've got a Bible with you, I'd encourage you to open up to Exodus chapter 20. We're going to be reading Exodus 21 to 11, which kind of carries us through to where we are up to today. So if you've got a Bible, Exodus chapter 20, and the word should also be up on the screen. There we go. Then God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the place of slavery. Do not have other gods besides me. Do not make an idol for yourself, whether in the shape of anything in the heavens above or on the earth below or in the waters under the earth. Do not bow down in worship to them and do not serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the father's iniquity to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing faithful love to 1,000 generations of those who keep my commands. Do not misuse the name of the Lord your God, because the Lord will not leave anyone unpunished who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. You are to labor 6 days and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You must not do any work, you, your son or your daughter, your male or female servant, your livestock, or the resident alien for whom is within your city gates. For the Lord made the earth, in the heavens and the earth, the sea, and everything in them in 6 days. Then he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and declared it holy. Now that's where we're up to so far in the 10 Commandments. Today we hit the famous next command, the command of the Sabbath. And it's something that I'm sure we all know, because we all love a good rest. We all love a bit of R&R after a long week's work. It's the way God intended it. It's part of the rhythm and natural cycle of creation. He even said so in our passage today, verse 11. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. When God created this world, one of the things he created was time. He worked for 6 and rested on the seventh. He gave this commandment to Moses. He even made sure that the people understood clearly what this pattern would look like for them. It says you are to labor 6 days and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You must not do any work, you, your son or daughter, your male or female servant, your livestock, or the resident alien who is within your city gates. He was very clear. Work 6, rest 1. It's a very simple pattern to follow. And it makes sense because we all know, we've all felt the need for rest. But humanity has tried to tinker with this idea plenty of times. In the French Revolution, the new Republican powers attempted to recreate the working week. And rather than 6 and 1, they decided a 10-day week was going to be better. Part of their humanistic worldview was a rejecting of everything biblical, and so that 10 was the number that they decided to settle with. And it worked for a little while, but eventually even the French Republicans returned to a 6 and 1 week cycle. And in Soviet Russia under Stalin, they also attempted to reshape the week, but rather than come up with a week, they decided that every day was going to look the same. The entire Russian population, or the population of the USSR, was split into shifts, allowing for factories and shops to run 24/7. And the split included men and women and children, and often those families were split into multiple different shifts. But it also meant that everything was always open and everything was always running. They called it the uninterrupted week. And to us, it can kind of sound a bit harsh, but it actually resulted in people having more time off rather than less. Rather than having one full day off, they had several extended breaks throughout the week. But it only lasted for two years. One Russian newspaper recorded a quote from a distressed father saying this: "What is there for us to do at home if our wives are in the factory, our children at school, and nobody can visit us? It is no holiday if you have to have it alone." The Russian uninterrupted week failed not because they didn't have enough time off, but because it destroyed relationships. It put productivity over community. But in God's pattern of things, even rest was supposed to be a communal exercise. So what about our world today? Well, I actually read about a guy by the name of Joel Gascoigne who came up with his own version of the uninterrupted week that he thought was going to be more productive and more restful. This was his pattern. He's going to get up at 4:30. He was going to spend between 5 and 6:30. He was going to have 90 minutes of focused work. Then from 6:30 to 9, he was going to gym, have breakfast work. Then from 11:30 to 3 p.m., he had lunch and an extended period of rest. And from 3 to 4:30, he had 90 more minutes of intense, focused work. Now, for him, every day was the same. Big chunks of rest, big sections of focused work. But he quickly realized even he couldn't keep this up. He quickly gave up on it because he realized that even big chunks of rest did not restore him in a way that a day of focused rest actually did. Now, lots of people have tried to tinker with this pattern that God instilled in his creation. But in almost all modern cases, even though they might work for a while, they all returned back to the normal working week set out by Genesis chapter 1. Remember the Sabbath by keeping it holy. That's basically what humanity has proven we kind of need to do. And it's very simple as well. There's only 3 ideas in that sentence. Remember, Sabbath, and holy. These 3 words make up the heart of this command we're going to look at today. But before we really dive into it, let's pray. God, we thank you that we can be here today, that we can take a day out of our busy weeks, a day out of the routines and the structures that we have built into our life to focus in and remember you. God, may we be reminded, may we remember today what the Sabbath is about, what it was about in the biblical history and the story of the Old Testament, but also what it is about for us, both spiritually and practically as human beings in the 21st century in Australia. God, may we recognize the joy and the pleasure even of this command, and may we learn to celebrate it and love it. May we learn to love your Sabbath day, and may we keep it holy too. And we pray all this in Jesus' precious name. Amen. Now, the word Sabbath has got all kinds of meaning attached to it, but it's actually a really, really simple word. It's the Hebrew noun of the verb form for rest. It literally just means a rest. And we know we don't have many problems with taking a rest. We all know that we need to take breaks. Some people might struggle to take one, but we all know we need to regularly stop throughout our week, throughout our day, and have moments of rest. We know we have to sleep. We know we have to have holidays. We know we need to do all kinds of things to rejuvenate ourselves. That idea is not even debated outside of these walls. We all know, all humans know, they need a rest. But the thing that makes a difference for us here in the church is not so much the idea of a rest, it's actually the ideas that surround this. Because the words remember and holy have often been forgotten in this, or ignored, or at worst forgotten. So today we're going to focus in on these 3 words. Remember the Sabbath by keeping it holy. We're going to start in the middle, and then we're going to think about the 2 actions that surround it. Because before we consider the what and the how of Sabbath, we need to understand the why. So why the Sabbath? Now, if you trace the idea of the day of rest in the Bible, you have to start in Genesis chapter 1. God created in 6 and rested on the 7th. But the next clear reference after that one is actually in the Exodus story as the people are being freed from slavery in Egypt. They are trudging through the wilderness, and God provides them there with manna, that little piece of dough that came from heaven. Over the 40 years of wandering through the wilderness, God provided them with food, but only on the first 6 days of the week. On that 6th day, God provided them with enough to survive both the 6th and the 7th day. We read about it in Exodus 16. On the 6th day, they gathered twice as much, 2 omers for each person. And the leaders of the community came and reported this to Moses. He said to them, "This is what the Lord commanded. Tomorrow is to be a day of rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. So bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil. Save whatever is left and keep it until morning." Even in the wilderness, the 7th day of the week was different. And it was a different day. It was a day for remembrance, for reflection, and for respect. And that's what the people in the wilderness did. You can read the rest of the story in Exodus chapter 16 if you want to see the full beginning of the Sabbath, I guess. Simply in the desert, though, God provided for them for enough for that 7th day so that they didn't have to do any work to collect it. They didn't have to do what was their normal pattern of life. They didn't have to do what they normally did. And if they collected more than they needed on any other day of the week, whatever they collected would begin to rot and begin to be infested with maggots before they got to eat it. But the 7th day was different. That didn't happen to anything extra they collected for the 7th day. No, that lasted. And after God gave this command to the people of Israel, it became an essential part of their culture. The 6-in-1 working week was part of their cultural and religious identity from that day forward. And when they actually failed to keep this command, it led to serious consequences for them as a nation. Look at the prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel, and God says through both of them that failure to follow the Sabbath was a reason for their eventual enslavement and exile. One of the major problems that the book of Nehemiah presents is the failure of the people of Israel to keeping the Sabbath. Like all the other commands, though, these people struggled with this one. They never kept it perfectly, and you could even argue that Israel itself was even horrible at keeping it. And because of it, God judged them. God's judgment included their failure to keep the Sabbath. But then we look at the New Testament. We jump forward. Jesus arrives on the scene and something seems to change. He comes along and we read passages like Mark 2, 27 and 28. Then he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of God is Lord even of the Sabbath." Or you can jump forward to passages like Hebrews chapter 4, which describes Jesus' saving work as giving people access to an eternal Sabbath, which God starts with us in the here and now. And lots of people read passages like this one and the one from Hebrews and think, phew, we don't have to follow that Sabbath law and that Sabbath command anymore, And while in a way that's true, that's definitely not the full picture that the New Testament paints. Yes, the Sabbath is no longer a legal command expected of us, but we often think that the legalistic requirements are what we are supposed to be carrying on. But I would argue that the Bible still makes pretty clear the moral expectations of Sabbath. We like to think of it more legalistically, though. We think of requirements that people have placed on it. We think the Sabbath means you shouldn't do this and you shouldn't do that on a Sunday. And if you grew up in the Reformed church that was shaped by the Dutch migrants, this was probably your childhood, or probably a good chunk of your life. What you couldn't do on a Sunday defined what Sunday was. Because people have always turned this command into a long list of things that we want to do, but God says we can't do on the Sabbath day. Now, that attitude has existed all the way back into Jesus' own day. So what's your personal experience of Sabbath? When somebody says that word to you, what do you think about? Do you think about the things that you think you shouldn't do or you were told you weren't allowed to do? Because the people who thought Sabbath was in terms of what they weren't allowed to do were the very people who clashed with Jesus about it the most, the Pharisees. These religious teachers had come up with this extensive list of things that they believed you couldn't do on the Sabbath. And it was a list so long that it bordered on ridiculous. They had this long list of things that they didn't believe anyone should do on the Sabbath. There were 39 different categories of work that they believed people shouldn't be allowed to do. They included things like lighting a fire and putting out a fire. The full list is just enormous. But my favorite has to do with falling walls. For a strictly religious Pharisee, if they came across a wall that had fallen on somebody on the Sabbath, they were only allowed to remove enough rubble from the scene to assess the situation. If they found a person stuck under rubble that had fallen on them on the Sabbath, they were only allowed to work out, could this person survive until the sun sets? Because if so, then just leave them there. They had to be pinned. If they believed that you could survive under rubble until sunset, they'd leave you there. Now, that's just crazy. And I doubt that's what Jesus would have done if he was presented with a situation like that. Yet at the same time, Jesus didn't reject the Sabbath completely. For Jesus, the Sabbath was still about the rest of God. Did he follow every 39 of the 39 categories that the Pharisees had come up with for the Sabbath? No. Did he create a long list of activities that he wasn't allowed to do? It doesn't seem so. In fact, it seems like he broke some of the commands of the Pharisees, which is what annoyed them the most. But he very much did set aside a day of the week, most likely Saturday for him, to attend temple and to go to other religious events. Look at what Luke 4:16 says. He went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went to the synagogue, as was his custom. Jesus didn't reject the Sabbath. He actually kept it, but not in the way the Pharisees, the legalistic Pharisees, wanted to. And yet, even after Jesus' death, that perception changed as well. Because the apostles acknowledged after Jesus' resurrection that his death and resurrection had changed the entire course of history. No longer would they dedicate the last day of the week to God. No, instead, they chose to begin their weeks with a day of rest and worship. The famous theologian B.B. Warfield put it this way: Christ took the Sabbath into the grave with him and brought the Lord's Day, our Sunday, out of the grave with him on that resurrection morning. And while Jesus' death and resurrection did change the context and understanding of the Sabbath, it definitely didn't destroy it. The New Testament church clearly still dedicated one whole day of their week to rest and worship. They didn't call it the Sabbath anymore. They called it the Lord's Day because they were celebrating the rest they found in their Lord. They still had a day dedicated to remembering their God by keeping it holy, by making it different. So this is where the Bible lands for us. So what are we to think then for ourselves? What do we think about our world today? How does this Old Testament commandment shape our lives in 21st century Sydney? How do we keep this command if it's now on a different day with a different name? What does this mean to us? Well, we have to think about these things. We have to answer those questions if we actually want to take God seriously here, if we want to take his word seriously. The first part is simple. We should stop our daily routine, stop our weekly work and rest once a week. God did that. We should do it too. The first and primary purpose of that, though, is for a reason. It's not just to rest. It's to remember what he has done. And we do that by secondly making that day holy. So first of all, what does remembering look like? This is where this command starts. Remember. The purpose of this command is to remember. The idea of remembering is an interesting one because we often get the ideas of remembering and recalling mixed up. Remembering is not recalling and recalling is not remembering because remembering requires a response. Now, I can recall that my wedding anniversary is on March the 7th. I can easily recall that date. But does recalling that date to Natalie show her that I care about it? Or do I actually have to act on that recollection in order to show her that I have remembered the importance and significance of that date to us? Remembering is much more than simply recalling information. It's actually acting on that recollection. If you remember your friend's birthday, but don't actually say anything to them about it, have you actually remembered it? And actually, are you even a friend? And the same goes for rest. What was the purpose of the Sabbath, and what's the purpose of our Lord's Day today? It is still to stop, to rest, and to reflect, to remember what God has done. Now, I'm sure most of you know that the Ten Commandments are found in two different places in the Old Testament. There's Exodus 20, which we are reading and making our way through, but then there's also Deuteronomy 5. And in each of these two accounts, the way that this command is expressed is slightly different, because the thing that the people are called to remember is slightly different. What we read in our passage today was to remember the story of creation. God created in 6 and rested in 1. That's the Exodus. But in Deuteronomy, it speaks about God freeing the people from slavery as the thing that they should remember. Because while they were slaves in Egypt, they didn't get one day off a week. There was no day of rest for them there. So the people of the Exodus had both creation and their redemption from slavery to remember. And we too could spend plenty of time reflecting on creation and God's redemption from slavery in Egypt. But I think we have something even better to remember. We too have a day to remember our redemption, not from slavery in Egypt, but from slavery to sin. We have been redeemed in a much greater sense than even the nation of Israel was. And we have the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus to thank for that and to remember. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, well, I can think about that anytime. I don't need a day to focus on that or to remember God's actions. I think about that stuff Monday to Sunday. Well, if you think that way, I actually don't think you fully understand the depth of what God is calling for here, or the way that God works in our lives. If you don't think you need or even want a day to stop and remember all that God has done for you in Jesus, then it's probably not that important to you. Now, I'm not saying on Sunday all of us should become monks, that we should just sit quietly and meditate on things. But we do need to stop. We need to take time out of our busy lives to remember what matters most to us. We live in a day and age that is non-stop, that is distraction-filled, that is stimulating continuously. And I think now more than ever, we need time to take a break from our routines, to stop, to switch off, to rest and remember the things that matter most. God knows, and he has always known, that humanity needs rest. He commanded us to. He gave us this law. But he also knows that we need something more. Because without Jesus, we are just creatures chasing the wind, destined to live hollow, shallow lives. That's why it's not just rest. It's remember and rest. We need to remember both who we are and what God has done. And when we understand that, when we remember that, then we can truly rest. Because he is our God. We are his creation. Even just that is something that we should dwell upon, to think about. He commands us to do it because he knows we need it, but also because he knows we have a tendency to forget that simple truth. That's why our Sundays are still important today. That's why they should still be sacred to us, because they are a day dedicated to remembering everything he's done. So if we are to stop, to rest and remember, but at the same time not become a monk for a day, what's the day of rest meant to look like for us? Well, that's where I think the last command really last part of the command steps into it, by keeping it holy. I'm sure most of us know we need to rest. We know we should set aside some time to remember all that God has done. But how many of us treat that time as holy? Now, it's another one of those words that can just be a real distraction. We can over-spiritualize it or under-spiritualize it. It's a part of the command, I think, that we probably fail to understand the most. Because what is the primary meaning of the word holy? It's to be set apart. It's to be different, a special or a sacred kind of different. Now, I'm not sure how many of you today would describe your Sunday as a special or a sacred kind of different. I'd say if we're honest, most of us probably don't treat a 1 day off a week like that. I think for a large part, the fact that we have a 2-day weekend now actually has eroded the importance of Sundays for most of us. The 6-and-1 working week, though, was for most of the Western world the norm until the last century. It wasn't until 1829 when an American trade union negotiated a 5-day working week that the 5-and-2 kind of became normal practice for most of the working world. From there, though, our weekend ceased to just be Sunday. Now it's both Saturday and Sunday. But why mention Saturday? Well, because it's so easy for us to make our Sundays look like Saturdays and our Saturdays look like Sundays, or at least very, very similar. And if our dedicated day of rest and remembering God is no different to one of our other days of the week, then is it actually setting it apart as different? Is it making it holy? Now, I think we live with the incredible blessing of having 2 days a week off, a whole day more than most of human history has ever had off, and still 2 more days than people who are enslaved have off. But have we just turned that day of rest into a second half of the weekend, or is it something sacred? Is it just another day that you don't have to go to work, or another day that you don't have to do what you normally do? Is there 1 day a week set aside as unique, as different, as sacred, as holy? Now, again, I'm definitely not saying that we need to become Pharisees, that we should come up with a list of things that we cannot do on that day. Because if you think about it, the people who thought that way were the people who riled up against Jesus. They were the ones who focused in on what they shouldn't do, when Jesus, in fact, focused on the opposite. He focused on what we should do on a day like that. I think all of us would be better served to come up with things that we should do on that day, that we should do on that focused day of rest and remembrance. If we come up with lists of things that we shouldn't do, it will always be a negative experience. But if we come up with a list of things we should do and be on that day, I think we will look forward to it every single week. We know, we've seen that we need to stop and remember all that God has done for us as a community. That's why this day was meant to be 1 day off for the whole community. We should stop and remember the importance of this together. That's why being a regular part of a church community is part of living out this command still today, even after Jesus. Does that mean the whole of your day of rest should be dedicated to the church community? No, not necessarily. Because even in my own experience growing up, being forced to go to church twice on a Sunday was so legalistic. It wasn't something that I wanted to do or look forward to do. But we should make our day of rest something that we enjoy and celebrate together. We should want to be part of this. We should want to celebrate him. We should want to remember him together. And that means it has to be much more than just a church service. We should be reflecting and remembering and celebrating our God together outside of these walls too. Together with our families, together with our community, together with people who know and love what we do. Keeping the Sabbath is a command that is God telling us to make time for him. Make time for the world, those who know him and love him together. It's a command to stop, to rest, to remember and to love God and love each other. This is a day dedicated and focusing on that very simple command, love God, love your neighbor. It is such a simple command. Remember the Sabbath by keeping it holy. And if there was ever a command that we should want to keep or love to keep, it's this one. This is God basically telling us, stop and celebrate. Stop and enjoy life. Stop and remember and celebrate all that I've done for you and all that you are free to do and be. Celebrate him, celebrate life, celebrate community, and do it all together. Why wouldn't we want a day of the week dedicated to fully resting, to resting in him and celebrating who we are and what we have in Jesus. Part of the problem has been we don't think we can take a break, or we don't think we should. We feel like we're not doing the right thing, or we can't do this and this and this. And in lots of ways, because we've either had a knee-jerk reaction to the legalism, or we fail to see the joy of true Sabbath, most people turn this command into a mere suggestion. You probably should take a day off, but only as a suggestion. But God didn't treat it that way. This has been God's pattern for life since creation. Just think about that. God, in his infinite power and wisdom, chose to express himself in the creation story as 6 days of work and 1 day of rest. Did God need to take a day off? No, he wasn't tired. He didn't need a break. He wasn't running out of energy or tired and just needed to have a chat. No, he decided that this was the pattern that he himself would follow. And that's a pattern that he enshrined in the laws that he gave to his people in Israel. Now, we know that Jesus changed our understanding of the law. We'll see that most clearly in the next couple of weeks, and things like adultery and murder. We know that he changed how we understand those and the depth that we have to apply them. But he didn't destroy those laws. He didn't scrap them and throw them on the rubbish heap. No, he focused them. And he focused them in on our hearts. And the Sabbath is no different. Because at the core, it's about our heart. Are we actually willing to stop and rest in God? Are we willing to take time out to celebrate and enjoy his community? To stop our weekly routines and remember what God has done? Are you, as an individual, willing to set 1 day of your week apart to be different? A day that is dedicated to your God, to your family, to your community, remembering who you are in Jesus. God could have turned to humanity and said, no, you are going to spend every moment of every day working. Or he could have said that you need to spend every moment of every day in total, utter, focused worship on me. He had the right to do both, but he didn't. Instead, he tells us to stop once a week to remember him, to treat that day as different, to treat it as a day that is holy, a sacred kind of special. Not to come up with lists of don'ts, but to celebrate the do's. So do you have a day in your week that is different? A day set aside as unique? A day where you simply get to enjoy God, enjoy his world, and enjoy his people? A day in your week that you genuinely look forward to because it's unlike any other. A day dedicated to the God that loves you. How you treat the idea of taking rest in God will reflect your heart. So what does it say about your heart and where you're at? Does it say that you trust God enough to rest in him? Do you trust him enough to stop? Do you love him enough to remember? Do you care enough to treat at least 1 day as a special kind of different? A day of joy and community, of family and even fun? Because our day of rest actually points us forward to eternity. And ultimately, the truth is, if you don't like the idea of Sabbath, then you're probably not going to look forward to eternity. If you don't like the idea of resting in God here and now, you're definitely not going to like what God promises comes next. So do you today trust him enough to rest in him, to rest in the salvation that he offers on the cross? Because he knows you down to your smallest part. He knows the rest that you need and the rest that you crave. Because he offers the deepest, truest rest to us, the rest for our souls in Jesus upon that cross. He offered us, he's given us the eternal rest that we long for, the security and comfort in knowing that he loves us, cares for us, and will provide for us eternally. Our challenge is to trust that that is true. And we can find it in Jesus alone. May we all crave the rest that he offers. And may we actually find it in Jesus. So let's come to him now in prayer. God, we live in a busy, crazy, distracted world. God, the internet is basically designed to keep us distracted perpetually, to keep us connected perpetually, to stimulate us from the moment we wake up to the moment we go to sleep. God, our busyness can pervade every aspect of life. But this morning we ask that you might help us reassess the way that we structure our week, that we might see the benefit, the joy, the celebration that the Sabbath actually offers us. But may we not see it in this legalistic list of things we cannot do, but may we see it as a day that we look forward to, a day where we get to focus in on the things that matter most, where we don't have to chase after a busy calendar or think about whatever it is that we need to be worrying about, but we can simply rest and remember everything that you have done for us. May we set aside a day that is different, a day that is sacred, a day that is holy, a day dedicated to the things that matter most. And God, our longing for rest is a reflection of the longing of our soul's deep desire to find rest in you. And we know, we've seen on the cross that that rest is offered to us, not because we deserve it, but because you offer it to us. So may we see in Jesus the ultimate source of rest, the rest for our souls, the rest that our hearts long for. God, may you equip us with everything that we need. May your Spirit guide us as we try and make our way through life. But may we do it following the healthy pattern that you have instilled in creation from the moment you made it from nothing. And we do look forward to that perpetual Sabbath, that eternal rest that we look forward to at Jesus' return. And we pray all this in his precious name. Amen. Now I want to close this morning with a section of that passage from Hebrews